It is the winter of 1936. Inside Marlborough House, an old woman sits in near total silence, reading the abdication statement of her eldest son, the King of England. Her name is Queen Mary, and she belongs to a generation of royalty that would rather die than cause a scandal. And her son has just surrendered the throne of a global empire for the love of a twice-divorced American woman from Baltimore. In that frozen moment, the old woman simply decides that her feckless son is no longer her son in any meaningful sense, and that from this day forward, the monarchy itself will be her only living child. How did a semi-impoverished minor German princess, born with a diminished royal title and hiding from creditors in an Italian villa, come to wield such iron authority over the House of Windsor? And what price did she, her husband, and her 6 children pay for the flawless public image she spent a lifetime manufacturing? Join me to find out. Princess Victoria, Mary of Teck, was born on 26 May 1867 at Kensington Palace, in the same room where Queen Victoria herself had been born 48 years earlier. To her family, she was always May, a nickname drawn from the month of her birth. The setting was grander than the reality. Behind the Kensington christening and the tangled skein of royal godparents lay a truth that would shape every decision of her adult life. Something in the baby's blood, at least according to the courts of Europe, was considered a flaw. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of King George III and a first cousin of Queen Victoria, a connection that should have secured a comfortable royal standing. Unfortunately for May, her mother had married rather far beneath the expected station. Princess Mary Adelaide was 30 by the time of her wedding, an age considered nearly hopeless for a royal bride of her era, and she carried the unkind nickname Fat Mary on account of her considerable girth. Her husband was Francis, Duke of Teck, a tall and handsome Württemberg officer. A significant footnote came with his bloodline. Francis of Teck had sprung from a morganatic marriage. His father, Duke Alexander of Württemberg, had fallen in love with a Hungarian noblewoman named Countess Claudine Rady, and although she was aristocratic, she lacked the necessary royal rank to produce children considered dynastically pure. In the rigid hierarchy of 19th century German courts, this mattered enormously. What it meant, in practical terms, was that Francis, and by extension his children, could never inherit the throne of Württemberg, and that their very right to be addressed as royalty was conditional. In the language of that court-obsessed century, Francis's blood was tainted. The practical result fell on his infant daughter. When the baby May was presented and registered, she received only the style of Serene Highness, a rank below the shining Royal Highness borne by Queen Victoria's own grandchildren. To a modern viewer, this sounds like splitting hairs, but to a Victorian courtier, it was a difference as vast as an ocean. Royal enough to be invited to the weddings and christenings of her grander cousins, the child was never quite royal enough to sit at the center of the table. She was exactly what the court whispered about her family behind their backs: the poor relations. The Teck family lived at Kensington Palace in apartments granted by Queen Victoria, where May shared a nursery with her 3 brothers. Royal, yes. Well-funded, no. Princess Mary Adelaide had inherited her branch of the family's aristocratic tastes without any of the cash required to fund them, and her husband Francis, though well-meaning, was hopelessly unequipped to manage a household or restrain his wife's spending. The Duchess adored clothes, carriages, charitable appearances in silk dresses, and grand dinners for grander cousins. Saying no to tradesmen was not among her gifts. By the early 1880s, the family debt had grown so large that creditors were openly harassing them at the palace gates. Queen Victoria, exasperated by the scandal attaching to her cousin, finally decided something had to be done. In 1883, when May was 16, the Tecks were essentially ordered out of Britain and exiled to Florence, where the cost of living was lower and the public humiliation could be conducted at a safe Italian distance. For 2 years, the family rented the Villa the First Cedri outside the city and lived as semi-impoverished aristocrats among the Anglo-Florentine expatriate set. May attended local Italian lessons, walked through the Uffizi, and developed a lifelong passion for the decorative arts and for collecting. Those Florentine corridors would follow her through her whole life. Something else followed her too. In ways that never fully left her, she absorbed the raw humiliation of being a princess whose family had been dismissed for being unable to pay their bills. Biographers who have studied her later habits agree on one point: the rigid, obsessive attention to royal dignity that would come to define her, the terror of scandal, the hoarding of jewels, the fixation on protocol, all of it germinated in those Florentine rooms. A royal family that slipped could be cast out. Mary did not intend to slip. By 1885, the family returned to England with the debts marginally contained through the intervention of relatives. May was now 18, tall, quiet, and by the standards of her time, past the first bloom of marriageability. She spoke fluent German, French, and reasonable Italian. She had read widely, and she had developed a careful, observant manner that masked a formidable intelligence. What she lacked was a husband. In the royal marriage market of the 1880s, a granddaughter of George III, with a morganatic father and a family recently rescued from bankruptcy, was not a prize catch. Yet her fortunes were about to change in the strangest possible manner, as we shall soon see. By the late 1880s, Queen Victoria was casting a shrewd eye across the unmarried young women of the royal connection, looking for a suitable bride for her troubled grandson, Prince Albert Victor, known in the family as Eddie. Eddie was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, which made him second in line to the British throne. On paper, a future of imperial splendor awaited him. The young man himself was a walking problem that no one in the family quite knew how to solve. Eddie had grown up alongside his brother George under a curiously restrictive regimen imposed by their father. The two boys had been educated together on board naval training ships and treated almost as twins, though they were very different. George was sharp, quick-tempered, and disciplined. Eddie was gentle, languid, and by every contemporary account, slow. His tutors despaired of him. His grandmother, the Queen, worried openly in letters about his listlessness, and courtiers whispered that he could barely be made to concentrate on anything for longer than a quarter of an hour. That was not a reassuring trait in a young man destined to become King Emperor of a quarter of the globe. Worse were the rumors. In 1889, Eddie's name became tangentially attached to the Cleveland Street affair, a scandal involving a homosexual male brothel in London, where aristocratic clients were caught up in a police investigation. The extent of his involvement remains unclear to this day, and most historians believe court officials worked aggressively to shield him from direct association. The whiff of the scandal clung to him regardless. Darker rumors attached themselves to his reputation in the decades after his death, including the absurd later conspiracy theory connecting him to the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. That particular rumor has been thoroughly dismantled by modern historians using official court ledgers that place Eddie nowhere near London at the relevant dates. What the theory actually tells us is nothing about his actual conduct and everything about how deeply unpopular and unsavory his reputation had become by the time of his death. Queen Victoria knew none of this mattered next to the pressing problem of finding the boy a wife. She considered Teck for several reasons that were at once practical and cold. May was royal enough in the broad sense, trained from birth in court manners, intelligent, sober, and crucially, available. Her strong character, as the Queen described it in letters, was a euphemism that clearly meant the girl had the backbone her intended fiancé so conspicuously lacked. The engagement was announced in December 1891. May was 24, Eddie was 28, and the wedding was scheduled for the following February. The engagement lasted 6 weeks. In the damp, disease-prone winter of early 1892, an influenza pandemic swept across Britain, and Eddie, already weak-constitutioned, caught the virus at Sandringham, the family's Norfolk estate, during the celebrations for his father's birthday. Within days, the influenza deepened into pneumonia. On 14 January 1892, surrounded by his family, Prince Albert Victor died at the age of 28, weeks before his wedding. The public outpouring was immense, with church bells tolling across the empire. May, by all accounts, was genuinely grieved, though one hesitates to use the word heartbreak for an engagement that had barely begun. Her wedding dress, already being prepared, was quietly put away. Newspapers wrote lengthy editorials about the tragic young prince cut down in his prime. In private, certain senior courtiers exhaled a long, complicated breath of relief. Whatever Eddie's personal charms, the prospect of him on the throne had terrified the political establishment. Queen Victoria, ever pragmatic, moved with startling speed. Summoning May to Windsor, spending time with her, the Queen apparently decided that the young woman was too well suited to the role of future queen to let slip away. The family had already evaluated her. She had been trained for the position. The solution, in the Queen's mind, was elegant and deeply Germanic. Prince George, Duke of York, was the second son and now heir to his father, and he needed a wife. Here was a perfectly suitable candidate already prepared for the role. George was initially reluctant, as was May. The two of them had known each other as cousins and had gotten on well, but neither had imagined a romantic union between them. Something distinctly odd hovered over the idea of a young woman moving from one brother to the next, with only 18 months between engagements. Public gossip, never charitable, muttered about dynastic convenience and emotional coldness. Yet Queen Victoria persisted, and within the royal family her persistence carried the force of law. On 6 July 1893, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, May married George in white satin trimmed with orange blossoms before a congregation that numbered the great crowned heads of Europe. Contemporary letters between George and May, written during and after their engagement, show an almost painful awkwardness, giving way to genuine affection. George wrote to her with a schoolboy's stiffness that gradually warmed into real love, and May, more reserved by temperament, wrote back with careful tenderness. By the time of their wedding, something like actual fondness had grown between them, and across the decades that followed, their partnership would mature into one of the most devoted marriages in the history of the British royal family. In the early years, though, the match was publicly viewed as exactly what it appeared to be, a pragmatic swap of brothers arranged by a grandmother with a throne to protect. May and George settled into York Cottage, a modest and rather ugly house on the Sandringham estate that had once been a bachelor's shooting lodge. From this unlikely domestic setting, the future House of Windsor would be raised. Between 1894 and 1905, May bore her husband 6 children in rapid succession. Edward, called David in the family, arrived first in 1894. Then came Albert, called Bertie, in 1895. Mary followed in 1897, Henry in 1900, George in 1902, and finally John in 1905. From the outside, the portrait looked impeccable. 6 healthy royal children, a devoted mother, a stern but loving father. The reality inside York Cottage was colder and stranger than the family portrait suggested. May was a mother of her era and her class, which meant that direct care of her children was delegated almost entirely to nannies and nursery staff. Her infants were brought to her for brief appointed periods each day, usually just before meals, washed and dressed and presented for inspection. Physical affection was rare, emotional warmth rarer still. George, for his part, treated his children with the iron discipline he had learned as a naval officer, and the combined effect of his sternness and May's reserve produced an atmosphere that her eldest son would later describe in his memoirs as the coldest nursery he could imagine. The deeper tragedy lay in what May did not see. A disturbed woman, hired as the family's second nanny after the dismissal of the first for insolence, turned out to be actively cruel to the children in her care. Favoring David, the eldest, to an unhealthy degree, she developed the ugly habit of pinching him and his younger brother Bertie right before presenting them to their parents so that the boys would enter the drawing room in tears. May, predictably alarmed by crying infants and eager to restore order, dismissed the children from the room as quickly as possible, which was precisely the effect the nanny had intended. For roughly 3 years, this arrangement continued. Only when the abuse was finally uncovered did the parents send the nanny away and replace her with Charlotte Bill, universally known as Lala, a gentle and devoted woman who would remain with the family for decades. The psychological damage from that nursery never fully healed. Bertie, the future George VI, developed a severe stammer that would torment him into his reign. David grew up with an emotional neediness and a resentment of his parents that he would carry to his grave, and both brothers, in later life, recorded in memoirs and conversations, their sense that their mother had been fundamentally unable to reach them as children, that her warmth was rationed, and her disapproval constant. One of the men she helped raise to be a king would one day walk away from the throne, partly in search of the love she had never quite managed to give him. Before we continue, I want to say thank you so much, everyone, for watching this video on Queen Mary of Teck. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of our life down below in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for future subjects, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me. So, I'll see all of you in the next video. Among the 6 children, one would never reach adulthood, and his story was for decades the darkest secret in the family photograph albums. Prince John, born in July 1905 when May was 38, began his life as an apparently healthy baby. Within a few years, though, it became clear that something was wrong. By the age of 4, John was suffering from severe epileptic seizures that grew worse and more frequent as he aged. He also exhibited what contemporaries described as winsome but slow behavior, a gentle, dreamy personality that did not fit the rigid expectations of a royal child. Modern biographers have speculated that John may have been on the autism spectrum, perhaps with what would today be called Asperger's syndrome. That remains speculation rather than established medical fact, and the only diagnosis confirmed by his physicians at the time was his severe epilepsy, an illness which in the early 20th century carried enormous stigma. Epileptics were routinely institutionalized in asylums. Their conditions were whispered about rather than discussed. For a royal family constructing a flawless public image, an epileptic son was a catastrophic embarrassment. In 1917, when John was 12 and his seizures were growing more frequent and severe, his parents made a decision that has provoked fierce historical debate ever since. They removed him from the family's main residences and installed him in a small farmhouse on the Sandringham estate called Wood Farm, where Lala Bill would care for him in seclusion. His mother visited him, his father occasionally did, and his siblings saw him rarely. Gradually, his existence vanished from public view. To the newspapers and to most of the empire, he simply ceased to exist as a member of the royal family. For much of the 20th century, this episode was framed as a case of heartless banishment, a cruel hiding of an embarrassing child. Modern historians have pushed back on that framing with more nuance. By the standards of the era, removing John to a quiet country house with a devoted nanny and allowing him a degree of personal freedom was actually progressive care. The alternative, which many aristocratic families chose, was consigning such children to state asylums where treatment was brutal and life expectancy short. Wood Farm, in this sense, was mercy of a particular kind, even if it came wrapped in concealment. On 18 January 1919, John died in his sleep following a severe seizure. He was 13 years old. May's diary entry for that day survives, and it offers one of the rare glimpses of her private emotional life, uncensored and unmediated. She wrote that the news came as a shock, but that for what she called the boy's restless soul, death had come as a great release. She described finding Lala heartbroken but resigned, and little Johnny looking peaceful in death, with peace finally arriving for his troubled spirit. The words are clipped and careful, but within them one can read a mother grieving in the only vocabulary she had available, the vocabulary of duty, release, and relief for a suffering child she had never quite known how to love in life. A particular story about Queen Mary circulated among British aristocrats for decades, often in hushed tones over cocktails, well into the second half of the 20th century. If the Queen was coming to stay at your country house, you had better hide the valuables, preferably the small ones. Definitely the Fabergé eggs. The good silver could probably be trusted, but anything portable, pretty, and historical should be locked away in a cupboard before her car reached the drive. The reputation had its roots in Mary's intense, lifelong passion for collecting. She had developed her eye for the decorative arts during those Florentine years of exile, wandering through the galleries of the Uffizi and the shops of the Arno. By the time she became queen in 1910, she had transformed into one of the most knowledgeable connoisseurs of royal provenance in Europe. She knew, with an almost terrifying precision, which objects had once belonged to which royal ancestor, which palace, which collection. An 18th century royal snuff box could be identified by her at a glance, its history traced through 3 owners without consulting a book. The problem arose when she visited aristocratic homes and saw things she recognized. A piece of furniture that had once belonged to Queen Charlotte. A jeweled miniature that had passed out of the royal collection generations earlier. Porcelain, commissioned by George III. According to persistent rumor, her admiration in such cases was not passive. She would gaze at an object with what contemporaries described as a terrifying fixed intensity, and she was reported to have murmured to hosts that she was caressing it with her eyes. Social convention, for an aristocrat faced with such a performance from the Queen Empress, left only one polite response. The object would be pressed upon her as a gift. In more extreme cases, the rumors grew worse. Items were said to disappear from houses during her visits, only for a royal secretary to arrive days later with a polite note, either returning the object with profuse apologies or offering to purchase it at a price well below its market value. The host, of course, could not refuse. Refusing the Queen was unthinkable. Fabergé eggs, cabinet miniatures, silver snuff boxes, all of them quietly migrated from private houses across Britain into the vast and growing collections at Buckingham Palace and Marlborough House. Was this clinical kleptomania, as some contemporaries whispered? Historians, including Hugo Vickers, who has written extensively on her, overwhelmingly reject that diagnosis. What Mary was practicing was something older and, in its way, more disturbing than simple compulsion. It was the extraction of objects by rank, a belief so deep she could not articulate it that anything bearing the marks of the royal past ultimately belonged to the crown, and that she, as the current embodiment of the crown, had the right to reclaim it by whatever social means were available. A velvet glove of admiration concealed an iron sense of entitlement. Her victims were not poor. They were dukes and earls. Yet the image of them frantically hiding their best pieces before her motor car arrived remains one of the stranger and more telling portraits of a queen who believed, with complete conviction, that Britain and all its finest things were, in some fundamental sense, hers. In August 1914, the world that Queen Mary had so carefully mastered began to burn. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited the alliance system that had held uneasy peace across Europe for decades, and within weeks the British Empire was at war with the German Empire. For the British royal family, this presented a problem of terrifying delicacy. They were, almost without exception, German. King George V belonged to the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the dynasty his grandfather, Prince Albert, had brought to the throne through his marriage to Queen Victoria. Queen Mary herself was a Teck, of the House of Württemberg. Their closest relatives included the German Kaiser, who was George's own cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, also a cousin, and a sprawling network of minor German princes who were now, overnight, enemies of the British Empire. Reading through the family tree in 1914 was like scanning a roster of hostile foreign governments. Across British towns, German shops were smashed by mobs, and German dachshunds were kicked in the streets. A national paranoia about spies and fifth columnists reached hysterical levels, and inconveniently for the royal family, the most prominent Germans in Britain lived in Buckingham Palace. The crisis came to a head in April 1917, when the author H.G. Wells published a stinging criticism of the monarchy in the press, dismissing it as an alien and uninspiring court. George V, whose temper ran hot, reacted with a now famous snap. "I may be uninspiring," he told courtiers, "but I'll be damned if I'm alien." Yet he knew, as did Mary, that the problem was not going to solve itself with an angry remark. The dynasty's German identity had to be erased from public perception, or the monarchy itself might not survive the war. On 17 July 1917, the king issued a royal proclamation. With the stroke of a pen, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha ceased to exist in Britain. In its place rose a new dynasty, named for the medieval royal castle on the Thames. The Windsors were born. Mary, Tecks, Battenbergs, and Coburgs across the family tree were issued new, resolutely English titles. The Battenbergs became Mountbattens, the Tecks became Cambridges, and 1,000 years of continental bloodlines were papered over with a single English name chosen specifically for its ancient, reassuringly British resonance. It was one of the most audacious acts of public relations ever undertaken by a monarchy, and remarkably, it worked. Cheering Windsors in the streets a year later was the same mob that had been smashing German shops in 1915. Mary's role in this rebranding was the role she had been born to play. Survival, she understood instinctively, required the shedding of inconvenient truths and the public performance of impeccable national loyalty. She threw herself into war work with the same rigor she applied to royal protocol, visiting hospitals, encouraging women's employment in munitions, knitting socks for soldiers, lending her name and her visible presence to the war effort. Her German accent, never strong, was banished entirely from public speech. Her German relations, still sending letters from Württemberg and Hesse, were met with silence. 3 months before the Windsor Proclamation, in the cold spring of 1917, a telegram had reached Buckingham Palace that posed a far more personal test of the dynasty's survival instincts. The Russian Revolution had deposed Tsar Nicholas II, George V's first cousin, and Queen Mary's friend by correspondence. The Tsar, his wife, and their 5 children were under house arrest. Britain was being asked by the new Russian provisional government whether it would offer them asylum. The initial British response was generous. The government, led by David Lloyd George, offered to take the Romanov family in, and King George V himself, horrified at his cousin's plight, initially supported the offer. Then, within weeks, the political calculation changed. George began to receive reports from his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, warning of rising anti-monarchical sentiment in Britain, of the danger that harboring a deposed autocrat might ignite the very revolutionary feelings in Britain that had destroyed the Romanovs in Russia. His own position, he was told, might not survive the importation of Nicholas. George made his decision. He instructed Stamfordham to press the government, repeatedly and insistently, to withdraw the offer of asylum. Lloyd George, a shrewd political survivor himself, took the hint. The offer was quietly rescinded. Stranded in Russia as the Bolshevik Revolution swept away the provisional government, the Romanovs would never leave. On the night of 17 July 1918, exactly 1 year before the Windsor Proclamation would erase George's German heritage, Nicholas and his entire family were shot in the cellar of the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg. His wife, Alexandra, his son, the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei, the 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, all of them were murdered by firing squad and bayonet, their bodies dumped in a forest and burned with acid. Queen Mary's precise role in the withdrawal of asylum has never been documented in surviving correspondence. Historians generally agree that she supported her husband's decision, because everything we know about her priorities suggests she would have. Dynasty came before kinship. Monarchy came before personal loyalty. Whether she privately grieved for her Russian cousins we cannot be sure, because she almost never left a written trace of such feelings. What we can say with confidence is that the woman who would later refuse to receive her own daughter-in-law would not have hesitated to sign off on a political decision that preserved the British throne, even at the cost of letting Romanov blood stain a Siberian cellar floor. George V's reign, which had begun in 1910 with the death of Edward VII, lasted 25 years and carried the monarchy through the war, the aftermath, the general strike of 1926, and the slow-motion collapse of the British Empire's economic confidence. Mary was at his side throughout, a calm, rigid, impeccably turned-out figure in jewels and tailored coats, becoming over the decades one of the most photographed women in the world. Her public image, once the subject of snickering about the poor Tecks, had solidified into something close to granite. By the 1930s, she was simply the Queen. Opinions she held on protocol were treated as binding. Her presence at a charity event transformed it, and her disapproval of any trend, however minor, could end it. The king, meanwhile, had never fully recovered from a serious lung infection that struck him in 1928, and by the mid-1930s, he was in visible decline. Heavy smoking had wrecked his lungs beyond recovery, and by the winter of 1935, the 67-year-old monarch was a man living on borrowed time. By January 1936, he was confined to his bedroom at Sandringham, fading in and out of consciousness, his breath labored, and his body failing. What the public did not know, and what would not be known for 50 years, was that the king's death was not entirely natural. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, kept a private diary in which he recorded his actions during those final hours. The diary was sealed until after Dawson's own death, and it was not published until 1986. When the contents finally emerged, they caused a medical and ethical scandal that forced a reassessment of one of the most sacred moments in the modern history of the monarchy. Dawson wrote, in clinical prose, that by 11 o'clock on the night of the 20th of January 1936, it had become evident that the king's final phase of dying might continue for many hours. The physician judged this prolonged end to be inconsistent with what he called the dignity and serenity of the king's life. Dawson also had a more pragmatic concern. He wanted the king's death announced in the prestigious morning edition of the Times, rather than in what he privately considered the less appropriate evening papers. To that end, he decided to hasten the inevitable. Into his dying patient's distended jugular vein, he injected a large dose of morphine, followed shortly afterward by cocaine. Within the hour, King George V was dead. Lord Dawson acted entirely on his own. The point must be stated clearly, because the subsequent scandal created much confusion. Dawson's own diary confirms that neither Queen Mary nor the Prince of Wales nor any member of the royal household was consulted or informed of what he intended to do. The Queen, who had been sitting with her husband through the final hours, believed she was witnessing a natural death. She had no idea that the actual moment of his passing had been engineered by the family doctor with one eye on the morning headlines. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. Mary, who had spent her entire life managing the royal image with obsessive precision, was herself the victim of an image management decision she never knew was being made. Her husband was, in effect, murdered for good press, and she went to her own grave, believing he had died peacefully in her presence. George V had never hidden his low opinion of his eldest son and heir. The king had once remarked, in the hearing of several courtiers, that he prayed David would never marry or have children, so that the throne might pass to his steadier second son Bertie, and eventually to Bertie's daughter Elizabeth. It was a cruel wish for a father to utter, yet in the end it was very nearly granted in a form that George had not imagined. David, now King Edward VIII, had come to the throne at 41 as one of the most popular princes in the world. Handsome, charming, a skilled speaker, comfortable with the press, he was widely seen as a modernizing force who might drag the monarchy into the 20th century. The reality behind the image was considerably darker. For years, David had been involved with a series of married women, the latest of whom was a twice-divorced American socialite from Baltimore named Wallis Simpson. By the autumn of 1936, with her second divorce proceeding through the English courts, it became unmistakably clear that the king intended to marry her the moment she was free. For Queen Mary, this news detonated everything she believed about the monarchy. A divorced woman could not be queen. The Church of England, of which her son was now supreme governor, did not recognize the remarriage of divorcees while their former spouses still lived, and Wallis Simpson had two of those. The Empire, Mary believed, would not accept such a queen. More fundamentally, the decision itself, the willingness to place personal happiness above the institution, represented a moral catastrophe that Mary could not forgive. She had buried a son. Now her favorite child proposed to trade the crown for a woman from Maryland. The constitutional crisis that followed in the autumn of 1936 is well documented elsewhere. The negotiations, the refusal of the Prime Minister and the Dominion governments to accept Wallis as queen, the desperate final weeks, the radio broadcast in which Edward told the Empire he could not carry on without the help and support of the woman he loved. On 11 December 1936, he signed the instrument of abdication and left for France. His brother Bertie, who had never expected or wanted the throne, became George VI. A famous quote has attached itself to Queen Mary from those December days. Legend holds that she gestured at Buckingham Palace in a moment of private bitterness and said of her son's decision, "To give up all this, for that." The remark sums up, with surgical precision, her worldview. It is also almost certainly apocryphal. No verified primary source records her saying those words, and historians who have combed through her surviving letters and diaries have never found them. What we can say, with documentary support, is that she regarded her son's abdication as the greatest act of selfishness she had ever witnessed. From that day until her death, she refused to ever formally receive Wallis Simpson. The wedding of the couple in France in June 1937 went unattended by her. Edward's correspondence with his younger siblings was restricted on her instructions. Behind the scenes, she actively worked to stage manage the terrified, stuttering new King George VI into his role, propping up his shattered confidence and lending him her iron presence at public events until he could find his own footing. The favorite son who had broken her heart was, to all intents and purposes, dead to her. The institution survived, as it always must. When Britain went to war again in September 1939, Queen Mary was 72 years old. Her younger son, now King George VI, urged her to leave London for the safety of the countryside, and after some resistance, she agreed to move to Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the estate of her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort. She expected to stay for a few weeks. The stay lasted nearly 6 years in total. Her presence at Badminton was a mixed blessing for her hosts. She arrived with a personal staff of 55, plus 70 tons of luggage, and immediately set about reorganizing her niece's home according to her own exacting standards. The Dowager Queen of England did not travel lightly. Contemporary diaries from the Beaufort household record her insistence on particular menus, her long readings aloud requested from exhausted ladies-in-waiting, her tendency to treat the entire estate as a personal royal residence that had been loaned to her for the duration. She also exhibited, throughout the war, a kind of physical courage that astonished those around her. Badminton was not directly bombed, but the threat of raids was constant, and the village air raid shelter was used more than once during the German Blitz campaigns. Queen Mary, refusing all offers of special royal provisions, sat in the shelter in the middle of the night alongside the local villagers, fully dressed, fully bejeweled, her pearls gleaming in the dim electric light. Appearing, even in a concrete bunker at 2 a.m, in anything less than the full regalia of her rank was out of the question for her. If bombs came, she intended to die as a queen. An unexpected enthusiasm gripped her during the war years. Badminton's parklands were overgrown, and Mary decided that removing unwanted vegetation was a suitable royal contribution to the war effort. She organized her staff, her hosts, and occasional visiting dignitaries into ivy-clearing expeditions, attacking the walls and trees of the estate with clippers and secateurs. It became something of a joke among her family that the Duke of Beaufort's trees were as much at risk from Queen Mary as from German bombs. Yet the war years also brought her private grief. In 1942, her fourth son, Prince George, Duke of Kent, was killed in an aircraft accident on active service while flying to Iceland. He had been her favorite surviving son, handsome and charming, and his death at 41 struck her harder than any public acknowledgement ever quite revealed. Her diary for that month contains a rare emotional note. She wrote that she could not believe her beloved Georgie was gone. The funeral found her in a thick black veil. Within days, she was back to clearing ivy. The war ended in 1945. Queen Mary returned to London, to her rooms at Marlborough House, and settled into what would be her final phase of life as the indestructible matriarch of the House of Windsor. Her son, George VI, was in visibly declining health, worn down by the strain of the war years and by a lifetime of heavy smoking. Her eldest granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth, was a grown woman, newly married in 1947 to Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. Already the next generation was stirring. In February 1952, her son George VI died suddenly at Sandringham, aged 56, of complications from lung cancer. He had outlived his father by only 16 years. His daughter Elizabeth, 25 years old, was in Kenya on a royal tour when the news reached her. She returned to Britain as queen. For Mary, now 84 years old and herself increasingly frail, the grief of burying a son was compounded by the extraordinary sensation of seeing her granddaughter ascend the throne she herself had once held. 3 reigns had now passed through her hands as mother, wife, and grandmother to British sovereigns. By early 1953, Mary's own health was failing. She had developed lung cancer, though the full diagnosis was concealed from her in the manner of the age. She understood, nevertheless, that she was dying. Her granddaughter's coronation was scheduled for 2 June 1953, a date chosen for the improving weather and the political need to consolidate the new reign. Mary understood that if she died in the weeks before the coronation, the court mourning protocols that would automatically trigger might delay or alter the ceremony. Her final wish was made known with the absolute clarity that had governed every major decision of her life. Her death, when it came, was not to delay the coronation. The great royal show was to proceed exactly as planned. She died at Marlborough House on 24th of March, 1953, 10 weeks before her granddaughter was crowned. She was 85 years old. Her wish was honored. The coronation proceeded on schedule, and Queen Elizabeth II began her reign with the Dowager Queen's blessing ringing, in a sense, from beyond the grave. Mary was buried beside her husband in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The official biography of Queen Mary was published in 1959 by the historian James Pope Hennessy, who had been granted unprecedented access to royal papers and to courtiers who had known her personally. The finished book was respectful, dignified, and carefully constructed to present Mary as the granite matriarch who had saved the monarchy through the abdication and the wars. It became the standard view of her for decades. What readers did not know was that Pope Hennessy, during his research, had conducted dozens of interviews with surviving courtiers, family members, and members of the royal household, and that he had taken detailed, scathing, unvarnished notes on everything he heard. These notes were far more candid than anything the official biography dared to include. They captured courtiers' private opinions, family gossip, and moments of startling honesty about the woman behind the public monument. Pope Hennessy placed his notes under an embargo, not to be published for 50 years after the completion of his biography. In 2018, the historian Hugo Vickers edited and published these notes under the title The Quest for Queen Mary. The portrait that emerged was, in many ways, the opposite of the Pope Hennessy biography. Lord Claude Hamilton, a former courtier who had known Mary intimately, told Pope Hennessy bluntly that she was one of the most selfish human beings he had ever known. Other courtiers described her habit of requiring her ladies-in-waiting to read aloud to her for up to 7 hours at a stretch, without a break, simply because it pleased her. Family members described her iron reserve, her inability to comfort her children, her obsessive preoccupation with objects and protocol, her almost complete absence of warmth toward anyone outside her narrow conception of royal duty. Reading those same notes carefully, a stranger figure emerges. Mary was not a monster. She was a woman who had been shaped, from her earliest childhood in Florentine exile, by the conviction that the institution of monarchy was more important than any individual within it, including herself. Every major decision of her life, from her marriage to her children's upbringing to her treatment of her eldest son during the abdication, flowed from that single conviction. She did not withhold love from her children because she did not feel love. She withheld it because she believed a royal childhood required discipline above all. Cutting off Wallis Simpson was not a matter of hating Americans. She cut her off because she believed the alternative was the slow rot of the monarchy itself. She was, in the end, the ultimate institutionalist. The crown, for Mary, was a living thing that had to be defended, fed, and if necessary, healed at whatever human cost was required. She paid those costs herself, and she demanded them of everyone who came within her reach. The House of Windsor, which still sits on the British throne as this is being recorded, exists in the form it does largely because Queen Mary willed it into being. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren have lived, and continue to live, in the emotional architecture she constructed. The poor relation from Florence, hiding from creditors in 1883, built that architecture stone by stone across 70 years of iron effort. Whether the costs she paid, and the costs she exacted from others, were worth the survival of her dynasty is a question each viewer will have to answer. What cannot be disputed is that Mary herself believed the question had only one possible answer, and that she went to her grave 10 weeks before her granddaughter's coronation, having never once doubted it.